So, hello everyone and welcome. So, today I thought I would talk about the Switch Pro, or the so-called Switch Pro, that is, and why I believe that it will basically not exist. So, there was an article that sort of sparked this video idea, but fans actually demanded for Switch Pro long before that article. So basically, Nintendo announced a new Switch revision, but it's actually a Switch OLED with a new skin on it. So it's just the Switch OLED and nothing else. There were like no changes to the hardware. The last major hardware revision that Nintendo made was with the ones with the Mariko chips. Those ones were manufactured on a lower node, and as a result of that, the power consumption was decreased. So from 13 watts to 5 watts. So the power consumption was pretty good for a handheld, that is. And yeah, basically the article just says that people were expecting a Switch Pro, but instead what they got was just yet another Switch revision. And I'm going to talk about why this will basically never happen. So, first of all, let's talk about the issues with the Switch hardware. So, the main reason with the Switch hardware that basically plagues all games on it is the memory channel configuration. So, the Tegra X1 chip, which the Switch uses, it has one single 64 bits memory channel that is shared for both the CPU and GPU. Now, for the next Tegra chip that NVIDIA made, they actually fixed this with the dual channel memory configuration. But on the X1, you're stuck with not only just one memory channel, but also one that is only 64 bits wide, so not a whole lot of memory. And it's also made worse by the fact that this memory is only clocked at 1600 megahertz. So it really just makes the memory bandwidth that much worth. The other issues are basically with the CPU and GPU. So uh, there's not only like the memory bandwidth that is an issue with the hardware. Uh, the Switch actually downclocks the CPU from 2 gigahertz down to 1 gigahertz, and the GPU is also underclocked to 700 megahertz. So it is quite a downgrade compared to the NVIDIA Shield, which is basically the full chip. And the GPU itself is also quite slow on some operations. So alpha blending, for example, we've kind of seen this with Link's Awakening, and in some levels, it just destroys the hardware because it does a lot of alpha blending in some levels. That is. The other issue is basically the slow I/O. So on the Switch, you basically only have internal eMMC and micro SD cards, and the USB ports are also USB 2 only. So if you use like an Ethernet card, well, an external Ethernet device or whatever, or the newer Switch dock, even that is USB 2 only. So yeah, the I/O speeds on the Switch is quite bad. The only good thing about it is that the internal eMMC chip, it's actually 8 bits wide compared to the micro SD slot, which is not just UHS-1 but also 4 bits wide. So it's actually twice as slow. So even though you may have like a very fast micro SD card, it will still not compare against the internal memory, because the internal memory is just twice as fast basically. And we're going to also talk about the issues with supporting Switch games on newer hardware. So the main issue is that basically each Switch game they ship with a full Maxwell driver, complete with pre-compiled shader assembly. Because of that, this makes some approaches like a virtual machine uh, quite a bit difficult, and this also makes other approaches such as just re-implementing the APIs also quite tricky as well. So you basically cannot really cheat because of that. You pretty much have to either emulate the GPU or have compatibility on the hardware level. And there's also the other issue that some Switch games, mostly Wii U ports, so Mario Kart 8, for example, they use the ARM32 mode. And the issue with that is that newer ARM SoCs, they basically completely remove that. So that's the other issue that Nintendo will have to fix if they have to support backwards compatibility on, for Switch games, that is. Now, of course, this only affects like 10 games or so. So it is realistically possible that Nintendo could just either patch the binary or just provide new binaries on board to support these 10 games. But the issue is that you cannot really take an approach like that for thousands of Switch games that are being released. So Nintendo is kind of a pickle here. And as a result of that, this means that Nintendo will need to either have hopefully a newer hardware that is powerful enough to emulate the Switch, or at least the GPU, or they have to remain compatible with it on the hardware level. So, because of that, we're going to assume that Nintendo is not going to do like a fundamental change of the hardware. So it will mostly be like the Tegra X1 chip, but with a few tweaks and enhancements. So, the major enhancement that they could do is use faster memory. And the irony is that the Switch OLED already uses faster RAM, but it is intentionally downclocked to 1600 megahertz. The memory chips on the Switch OLED, they can actually be not really overclocked, but they can be clocked at their standard speed, which is 2100 megahertz. And all Switch OLEDs, you can basically set that RAM speed, and you don't have to do any kind of RAM overvolting or stuff like that. The other thing that I would do to such a Switch Pro revision would be to basically overclock the CPU to 2 gigahertz, so its intended speed, and allow games to use the fourth core, because the fourth core is reserved for the OS. However, because we are basically overclocking the CPU, it makes sense for games to actually allow the usage of the fourth core as well. Unless Nintendo may decide that, there are some poorly optimized games that hog the fourth core, thus they may not want to do that. But and the GPU should also be set to the full speed, to the full extent possible, that is. Shipped with 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, the thing is that the hardware already supports a memory configuration like that. You can actually just desolder the memory chips on your Switch, and then with a custom firmware, you can force the memory mode to 8 gigabytes. Now, there's not a whole lot of reason to do that on current Switches, but yeah, dev kits they also ship with 8 gigabytes for making the debugging easier. The other improvements that I would do is basically either improve like the onboard memory, so 200 gigabytes of internal memory. So uh, the idea is that Nintendo may not want to enhance the Switch to support UHS-2 micro SD cards. So the that's why I've suggested that maybe instead they include enough storage to the point that people may not rely as much on micro SD cards. The other thing that they could do is make sure that they have some kind of onboard UHS-2 configuration. Uh, Now, they may do that, or the hardware that, well, the way that they set up the hardware may not allow that. So I'm not sure if that's even possible, to be honest. But I believe it is. Onboard Ethernet, it should really use USB 3 speeds. In fact, if you have Atmosphere custom firmware, you can actually force USB 3 and benefit from faster internet. So that's cool. Uh, so basically, this is what it would look like. So this is actually like my hacked switch that you're looking at right now. So the CPU would be like well over 2 gigahertz, and the GPU would be like now it could be like 1 gigahertz or a bit more than that. And the memory on my Switch is actually very close to the standard RAM speed. It can't quite reach 2133 megahertz because I will have to overclock the memory for that. But newer Switches, they do support that speed just fine. And so what is the end result of such a so-called like Switch Pro? So I've noticed that on my Switch, they were like an improvement of 50%, around 50 to 100%. So it is quite noticeable. And what really improves the frame rate is the memory bandwidth. So the moment that you overclock the RAM, that's when you notice a difference. And because most Switch games, if not all of them, are basically they ha- they don't have like a lot of memory bandwidth to work with, so that really hampers the performance of your GPU. Faster I/O would also help with loading times. This is especially noticeable on some games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, as well as less stuttering in games that load new eras from storage. So Link's Awakening is a huge offender of that. So this game, it's so bad to the point that playing this game on the internal storage or micro SD card, if you have a faster one that is better than playing the game from the cartridge, because the cartridges, they actually are quite slower when it comes to IO speed. So yeah, good to know. And the increased RAM storage, it will basically allow for higher resolution textures. Of course, the downside of that is that if games end up doing that, uh, the issue is that the loading times will get increased as a result of that. But if they use like UHS-2, that is sort of well, it won't be as big of an issue as before, basically. The result of all of these changes is that basically we will be able to get like PS4 and Xbox One ports to the Switch. Not quite like those consoles, but very close actually. So on the software side of things, so Nintendo could decide to basically push updates to increase the resolution of games. So for example, let's say that Pokemon Shield, Nintendo decides that on the Switch Pro they could increase the internal resolution to 1080p. And it's actually possible already with hacks or cheat codes on an actual Switch if you overclock it. So that's good to know. Also 60 FPS patches in some cases, not all of them, because some games are kind of hard code their code against the a set frame rate. So yeah. In the OS, Nintendo will also make sure that both hardware are separated, kind of like handheld and docked mode. So we may also see the release of Switch Pro releases, much like what we saw actually on the new 3DS. But the new 3DS only got like 4 games that were like that. So it's possible that Nintendo may not want to do that again. What will not change? So no 4K output, not even for the UI actually, uh, because it's going to kind of like give the idea to people that uh, the Switch will be able to do like 4K gaming for free games, and that's just very unlikely because even for 1080p, even with the enhanced specs, it will still struggle to reach good frame rates in some cases. The UI, I don't expect huge changes to it either, because it just works fine as it is. Switch cartridges will not change, although, as I said earlier, they may decide to release some Switch Pro cartridges if they release a Switch Pro, of course. Other components will not change as well. The hardware may be thicker, so to allow for better cooling, or they could just like stick with the existing cooler but make it spin faster. Won't be ideal, of course. And in fact, Nintendo is mostly known to prefer silent consoles. Even back in the Wii U days, uh, the main reason why they downclocked the CPU that much was because they were concerned about the noise and the power consumption. And this will mostly translate to the Switch Pro as well. So the issues with such a hypothetical Switch Pro version, the power consumption will be greatly increased. So it will go from like 5 watts to 15 watts easily, or 13 watts depending on the situation. This will most likely force Nintendo to make the console thicker and ship the console with a bigger battery. The issue is that it will most likely increase the cost of the console. The other alternative is that why even bother and just make the form factor the same. But the issue is that the battery life will be similar to the first revision of the Switch. Now, they could fix that with a lower node, but this is very unlikely to happen due to chip shortages. So, yeah, we are most likely going to be stuck on 16 nanometer or 14 nanometer. The performance improvement in some games that I've tried, at least with the CPU and GPU and memory overclock, it was only like a 20 FPS improvement. So the game was going from like 30 FPS up to 50 FPS. And because of that, this may not actually convince Nintendo to release such a hardware because even though it would help in most games, in some cases, the games will be barely helped by the improved memory bandwidth and the higher GPU clock speed, mostly because the uh, hardware itself, the architecture of it, is mostly the same. So unfortunately, Nintendo may simply decide that it's simply not worth it, and that seems to be the case actually. So in conclusion, due to software decisions that Nintendo took, so mostly like the drivers ship with games, as well as hardware limitations, so mostly down to the single memory controller, as well as the fact that it's only 64 bits wide. uh, this really limits the upgrade options for Nintendo because they cannot use like the Tegra X2 because it is not backwards compatible with the X1. And if they stick with the X1, the improvement will be significant, but not enough to the point that this Nintendo may decide that it warrants the release of a Switch Pro, basically. Now they did do something like that before with the new 3DS, and the new 3DS was not it helped in some games actually, but it was not like a huge improvement. So it's possible that Nintendo simply does not want to repeat that scenario basically, and maybe they decide that the Switch as it sells fine, and therefore there is no reason to ship a Switch Pro that is most likely going to be more expensive. So the price is going to be at minimum $400, and even at $400, they're likely going to lose money compared to the Switch OLED, which people still bought anyway. Uh, and for these reasons, the successor may not even feature backwards compatibility. Nintendo could simply decide that it is not simply worth the pain and simply drop compatibility with Switch games. Now, of course, if this does happen, it's likely going to create a lot of backlash. Uh, so in that case, if they ever want to do like backwards compatibility in the future, it will most likely going to be something like Vita 2 HOS. So Vita 2 HOS, what it does is basically load the ELF binary in memory, and then it tries to recompile the PS Vita shaders in Switch format, as well as intercept the API calls and re-implements them. So if Nintendo ever decides to implement backwards compatibility on the newer revision, that's the most likely approach that they're going to take. Because otherwise, it will have to be full emulation. And I'm not really optimistic about a Switch emulator running on the successor because it's going to be quite intensive. But if they do take an emulator approach, it's most likely going to be like Microsoft. So it's only going to be like a whitelist of supported games. But yeah, that's basically it for now. And basically, the reason why a Switch Pro is unlikely, and it's in fact more likely that Nintendo is going to make a Switch 2 or any successor and not have any kinds of backwards compatibility at all. So thank you for watching and bye.